Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles." The one in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, "I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." For the word of the Lord, thanks be to God.
Well, I wonder how you're feeling this morning, how your week has been, or how this morning's gone. This morning before the 8 o'clock, I was a bit stressed and running late and getting the handout printed out and got them all printed. And then I realised there was a big mistake on the front there, so that caused me a bit of stress. Someone else, as they were coming in, they realised this morning their car had been broken into, and that was unfortunate. And then a bit later on, as someone was setting up communion, they spilled wine all over the table there in the back room. So that was just some of the things that we struggled with earlier today. But in your life, I wonder what your stress points are. Might be you're feeling tired or worn out as a parent or grandparent, or overworked through work or even other volunteer commitments that you serve and work in. Perhaps you're anxious about health issues for yourself or for a loved one, or still adjusting to a loss or a big change that's happened in your life. I know I'm still adjusting very much from the post-COVID time, if we can call it that. I'm not sure, as we're in this funny phase. Well, whatever you're feeling, all of these emotions are expressed in the book we're looking at in this term 2. We're looking at the book of Psalms, and we all face temptation, we all struggle, we all experience various suffering and disappointment in our lives. And the Psalms are very honest about all of these. And yet my main message for this talk today is, when life sucks, to put it bluntly, you still have a choice. Mightn't be an easy choice, but nonetheless, you can still make the decision, with God's help and the help of his people, to still trust God. There's a well-known book, The Road Less Travelled by Scott Peck, that opens with the words, "Life is difficult." This is a great truth, the writer says. And he goes on to talk about the journey of development as a person that involves experiencing both God's love but also his suffering. Now, that's one psychiatrist's perspective in that book. But as we come to the book of Psalms, the main prayer book of the Bible, we're also presented with a pathway to travel. And in the entryway or the gateway into this book of Psalms, which includes raw human emotion and struggle, we start with Psalm 1 last week, which presents two ways to do life, two ways to live. It says, "Blessed is the one who delights in God's law, who meditates on it day and night. They will be like a tree planted by streams of water, whose leaf does not wither." Yet it then talks about the other way of life, those who walk in the advice and counsel of the wicked, and they will be like chaff that the wind drives away. So two ways to live, the way of the Lord or the way of the popular way, the way of the wicked. Well, it sounds straightforward in theory. You look at that and you go, well, of course I want to take the good and righteous path. But then our experience is often not like that. And we need to reflect on these things and realise that God's people don't always prosper. Sometimes our lives seem unfruitful. We all have griefs and burdens. And actually, it's a privilege to weep with those who weep and to mourn with those who mourn. One of the great privileges I have as a leader or church minister here is to be with people in their grief, to take a funeral for someone who has died. We must be aware that life is not always prosperous and fruitful, as a superficial reading of Psalm 1 might suggest. Life is difficult, even devastating. Yet nonetheless, we all have that choice, don't we, of which path to take. And as followers of Jesus, or for those who are, we're invited to keep trusting him, to keep believing even when life sucks, even when all you want to do is give up, or swear, or shout, or cry, or tell God or someone else to get lost. And God can handle those reactions, and we see them in the Psalms. Yet the one thing we're invited to do is still to believe, to trust, even in those experiences. Well, that aspect is brought out in a sense in Psalm 1, but that choice is also made clear in today's Psalm, Psalm 2. And Psalms 1 and 2, they have similarities and some differences, even though their style is quite different. So Psalm 1's more of a wisdom psalm, if you're kind of a reader of different genre. Psalm 2 is called a royal psalm. It was used by Israel on occasions of the coronation of a new king in Jerusalem. Yet they're different genre, those two psalms, but together they work to form the gateway to the book of the Psalms, and also there's other similarities in them. You might remember the start of Psalm 1 said, "Blessed is the one who," and it talked about what it means to be blessed. Psalm 2 ends with virtually the same phrase, "Blessed are all who," right at the end, to bookend Psalms 1 and 2. And both Psalms talk about warnings and provide warnings of the path that leads to destruction. And they both provide a clear choice between delighting in God and trusting in him versus the popular or common path that the rebellious take. So I invite you to look more closely now with me as we work our way briefly through Psalm 2. It's on the handout, or you might have a Bible on your phone or something like that. And we didn't set it up exactly this way, but Karen might even at times be able to bring up parts of the reading on the screen as well. But firstly, verses 1 to 3, which present arrogant kings and rulers of the world. It opens, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain?" verse 1. Verse 2, "The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed one." It's describing all who are in rebellion against God. And it asks why, because the psalmist is saying it's foolish to oppose God? How could a human ruler oppose and rise up against the ruler of heaven and earth? Verse 3, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles, in quote marks there, characterising what those would-be rulers might be saying in searching for freedom and their own power. Well, freedom, of course, is a good thing, and yet the rebellious here think by throwing off these chains and limitations given by God, they'll be able to be free. But as we seek the wise path and reflect on these things, we realise that true freedom doesn't come by just seeking to do whatever you want. It doesn't come by ignoring our limitations. It actually comes by doing what we're made to do, by choosing the right limitations, by embracing the God-given limits for our lives. It's the same for people back then and the same for us today in the 21st century. Here in Bayside and Sandringham, we're in a fairly prosperous area. Many of us have great privilege, education, opportunity, choice in our lives. We have wealth, many of us. I have lots of freedom and choice and opportunity. And in a place like Bayside, we're constantly tempted to pursue different things for the good life, I think. But often those choices are framed with no reference to God at all. And I'm not suggesting we should all pack up and become ascetic or avoid all pleasure in our lives, but actually it's an opportunity for us to choose wisely, to have wisdom in our choice and opportunities, to serve and enjoy and experience God in the various ways we can. The abundance of gifts around us, of creation, of pleasure, of free time, of wealth that we can be generous with, of homes we can share. And part of that wise pathway I want to suggest is not by throwing off all limits, but by recognising our God-given limits that He's given us. I need to embrace my limits, my physical limits, my limits to be able to do what I want, my limits in church ministry. I know I can't shape this church according to my own image, but actually it's wanting to seek God's wisdom for what He has for this place. I need to recognise that there's demands on my life, responsibilities. I can't do everything and please everyone. I need to rest and let go. And all of us are called to have this posture of surrender and submission to God. To recognise that God's definition of success is often different to what we might naturally think. And this is an idea that's brought out in these verses of Psalm 2, verses 1 to 3, where the rebellious, they want to live a life with no limits and no godliness, but we're invited to recognise our limits. Jesus shows us the way, of course. He surrendered to the Father's will. He submitted more than anyone. He gave up his freedom, motivated by love and trust. He submitted to even evildoers and to rulers and kings of his time. He made the most difficult choice to die on our behalf. And we also have that choice to recognise God's limits and to not always pursue worldly dreams, but to trust even when it might involve suffering and struggle. Well, so Psalm 1 opens with this invitation not to be like those wicked rulers, verses 1 to 3. Now we come to verses 4 to 6, which focus on God in heaven on his throne. And these verses talk about how foolish, how laughable their behaviour is. God scoffs at them, it says. He rebukes them in his anger. He says, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain, speaking of Jerusalem. And it is laughable to oppose God. And yet we must also, I just want to note that it's not suggesting in this psalm that God's people should ever laugh at those who oppose God. Later in the Bible, in Acts 4, the first disciples of Jesus use this psalm to refer to a situation where they experienced persecution and suffering. And they relate this psalm to the cross and God's redemption through Christ. And they respond in trust of God's sovereignty, but also with a sense of compassion to those who are opposing them and God's church. And we're to have the same kind of posture, not to kind of laugh and criticise those who aren't in relationship with God, but to recognise we're not deserving either, and to trust God and his sovereign plan, and to respond with compassion and love, knowing that God is in control on his throne. It's laughable to oppose God, but we don't laugh at those who do oppose God. Judgment is left to him. So verses 1 to 3 of rebellious rulers, verses 4 to 6 of God in heaven, and now the third part, verses 7 to 9, and that is of the scene of the anointed king on his throne in Jerusalem. You see there from verse 7, I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. And this psalm is actually quoting an earlier part of the Bible, 2 Samuel 7, where God makes this special promise to God's king, David, and he says to him, I will raise up your offspring and establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. I will discipline him with a human rod and with blows from others, but my faithful love will never leave him. Your house and kingdom will endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. So that's the earlier promise in 2 Samuel 7. And now that idea is picked up in this psalm, talking about God being a father and the king being like a son. And so the Davidic king, whoever that might be, Solomon or one of his sons or grandsons, are to use these words of the coronation psalm at their coronation when they're being anointed and the crown is put on their head. So verses 1 have the opposing rulers, verses 4 to 6, God in heaven, verses 7 to 9 of the king on his throne in Jerusalem. And now we come to verses 10 to 12, which is again speaking to those rebellious rulers and nations. Verse 10 says, therefore you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So that's the invitation of Psalm 2. Not to be foolish, but to be wise. To come to God's anointed one in Psalm 2. Well, those words in Psalm 2 verse 2 of anointed one is simply the Hebrew word Messiah, where we get the Greek word Christ that we more commonly use today. And it's a psalm based on that promise given to David and for his offspring in 2 Samuel 7. And did you hear me mention in that promise, it says that this chosen one will be disciplined with a human rod and with blows from others. And by going to the cross, Jesus is the one who will establish this throne, God's throne, forever. God's faithful love never leaves him, even though he submits to the Father's will and to the hands of wicked men. And God's love will never leave us if we kiss this Son, if we embrace him, if we come to him, if we trust him. God's anointed King, Jesus. Last week I claimed that Jesus is the blessed one of Psalm 1. Today I want to say Jesus is the royal King, the royal Son of Psalm 2. And by following this Jesus in trusting amidst suffering or hardship, we might look foolish or even despised by some. But it is the blessed path for life. Jesus is the one who surrendered, who gave up his freedom, who wasn't like those rebellious rulers who wanted to throw off their shackles. I remember a few years ago when I was in Jerusalem, you'd go to the Church of St. Peter and there was the courtyard where it was thought to be the place of Caiaphas' courtyard, the high priest. And underneath are some ancient cells that you can go down into. You couldn't take a photo, unfortunately. I was trying to find one. And there you are looking at these ancient cells where people have been imprisoned in the past. And you can just imagine that's where Jesus was, chained up like a criminal before then being taken to the ruler of the time, Pilate, and executed on the cross. Jesus is the one who gave up his freedom out of love and trust. And yet God's love never left him. He vindicated his servant and king by raising him from the grave. And we can know in embracing him that his love will never leave us. So no matter where you're at today or at the moment, no matter your struggle or temptation or fear, you're invited to kiss this Son, to trust him. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Let's pray. Oh God, when there's suffering or pain or disappointment, unfulfilled hopes, the temptation can be to harden our hearts to you, to harden ourselves like clay. But you invite us to melt as wax in your hands. Help us to trust in your Son, who was chained, who was scoffed at, who suffered on our behalf. Help us to submit to you, to admit and embrace even our own limits, to choose the wise path and entrust our whole selves to you through your Son Jesus. We pray in his name. Amen.
Thanks, Jeremy.